And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over and over and over 1,000 times again for you. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day, I'll rise up in spite of the end. I will rise, we will rise, we will rise, we will rise.
Hello, my name is Michelle Zabel, and I'm an assistant dean at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the proud director of the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. So this year of working virtually has necessitated some really creative approaches to conferences. For us, we've spread the Training Institute workshops over the last 9 months, hosting just a few workshops each month. And I want to thank you for joining in these discussions and participating each month. This summer, we're continuing the Training Institutes in a way that will allow you to take us wherever you go. And I am hopeful that you are able to take a break and get away safely. We're going to be recording our summer workshops and releasing them each month so you can watch them anytime during the month that works for you. These workshops are going to be on a wide range of topics, all focused around strengthening your skills as you support children, youth, and families. A quick note, some presentation reference information and graphics that are embedded within the presentations may not be fully explained within the audio, but all of the presentations are accessible to download, as well as the resources and handouts that correspond to each workshop, and I encourage you to do that. Thank you for listening to the audio recordings of our summer workshops for Training Institutes Live. While you're enjoying these summer months and workshops, we'll be planning and working towards future Training Institutes when hopefully we can all see each other in person. Take care, enjoy your summer. Thanks.
All righty, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our presentation on strategies for implementing and expanding youth peer support services. I'll start by introducing ourselves. Again, my name is David McClung. I work as a youth engagement specialist, evaluator, and research associate with the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health at UT Austin. And I'll let our other two panelists introduce themselves as well.
Hello, everybody. My name is Evelyn Clark, and I'm a change specialist and equity consultant with Change Matrix, and I'm also a certified peer counselor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Baird. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a wraparound trainer and consultant at the System of Care Institute at Portland State University. Prior to that role, I did a lot of work working on research projects on implementing youth peer support. And prior to that, I was a wraparound youth partner. Really excited to be here today.
So as we begin, we're just going to kind of start this conversation. And again, I think that's really what we hope this presentation is. More than anything is really just kind of a conversation between the three of us, and hopefully something that maybe provokes some thoughts and maybe some conversations wherever you may be listening from as well. And so let's just begin by trying to define what youth peer support is. And so I want to run through some quick definitions of what this sort of entails. And then I want to turn it over to Caitlin and Evelyn to try to expand on what this actually looks like in practice, recognizing that definitions are sometimes rigid, I think, sometimes in the way that they get interpreted. And one of the things I really love about peer support is that it's not as rigid in its approach, but really provides sort of a life-giving opportunity for us to really engage people in a way that I think is unique from some of our traditional systems. And so as we begin this definition, then let's just start by kind of acknowledging that youth peer support encompasses a wide array or wide range of activities and interactions between near-age peers who share similar experiences with mental health challenges, substance use, or both. And so when we talk about peer support, we're really not talking about a single service per se. It may be billed that way sometimes, but we're really talking about, again, a wide array of different activities and interactions that build engagement, build mutuality, build the opportunity for relationship and the ability to engage in services and systems, and to kind of take that proactive approach. And then recognizing that because of those features, peer support is really distinctive, but also complementary of the roles that other service providers may play within our kind of service array or service continuum. And then just recognizing again that youth peers interact with youth and young adults as peers by sharing that common experience. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means and why that common experience is really important for being able to model resiliency and recovery. And so let's just start with Caitlin. Caitlin, I wonder if you can share some of your experiences of what this really looks like in practice and kind of what peer support could look like on, say, a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I certainly think that all of these are important things that youth peer supports encounter on a daily basis, particularly doing things that like acting as a bridge between other providers and services and making sure that you're relating through shared understanding and shared experience with your young people. Where youth peer support is really unique is we're coming in with our own lived experience in these various systems or with our own mental health or substance use disorders to relate to young people and sort of provide a beacon of hope so that they can see that what their current situation may be does not need to be forever. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that youth peer support specialists are superheroes or that we need to be the ultimate role models. A lot of the times we are still in recovery. And so on our day-to-day basis, we want to make sure that we're taking care not just of our youth and each other, but ourselves. So self-care is definitely a very important aspect of the day-to-day instance of youth peer support. Additionally, in any normal day, a youth peer might be attending team meetings, doing case notes or case management, spending time with their youth, just kind of kicking it. I think one thing about youth peers is like you really kind of have to have a good vibe about you because youth and their BS meters are really, really accurate. So they're not going to want to, share with you or spend time with you if you don't kind of have like the X factor a little bit as a youth peer. But you also might be doing crisis response and things like that. Something else that I think gets missed a little bit, particularly by professionals and providers that we might work with. Youth peer supports are professionals, so we do have to go through specific training. We are mandatory reporters. There are certain requirements of this job that really set those boundaries between being friends with a young person and being a friendly provider with the young person. So I know that sometimes when I was defining my role, particularly with professionals and family members, a lot of it was also defining what youth peer support was not, right? Because I think that there are some common misconceptions being that this is a relatively new role. Evelyn, I'd love to hear what your experience has been working with youth peers. And I know that you've done a lot of work with juvenile justice too, and not a lot of youth peer supporters in that system. So yes. I would love to hear from you.
Awesome. That's exactly the direction I wanted to go in, Caitlin. Thank you. Yeah. So again, Evelyn, and I actually became a certified peer counselor in 2012 in Washington State. And so I have experience working with young people in wraparound services here in Washington, but also uniquely, I think what I bring is that I was incarcerated as a young person. And so in a detention facility here in Washington State, they had a mental health contract, and I was the peer that was hired to work with the young people. And what really kind of got me into this position, I would say, is that when I was incarcerated, I did not know what a peer counselor was. And as I started working in the field, I noticed that there wasn't any peer supports for young people that were incarcerated. And so I kind of, as I worked closely in that system, realized that, well, even just thinking about when I applied to be a certified peer in Washington, the application to apply was so focused on mental health, which I understand you have to have that or substance use to become a peer. However, when you hit the juvenile justice system, there is a huge stigma that's there that, we would rather talk about like the crimes that we committed versus, yes, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I have these things. And so what I noticed is that a lot of the young people that I supported in that system, we kind of have to fluff up, if you will, like what our mental health is. And I think that as we move further into this work that we're doing nationally, that providers can understand that if you've touched a system like child welfare or juvenile justice, that we also have mental health challenges and experience trauma from even being in that system. I think that we can expand the work with juvenile justice and peer support, because again, we know that majority of young people in that system are Black and Brown, and about 70 to 80% have an undiagnosed mental health condition or challenge. And so in my role, very similarly as you, Caitlin, you know, the word professional, right? Like that was key in that, working in that system, because here I am, as you know, I was younger with a criminal history, and you know, I kind of looked like the youth, kind of dressed like them, and there was a lot of stigma that went with that. I had to really fight to really define what peer support was in that system, and still do in a lot of these systems. Now more states are pushing towards getting peer supports to help these young people. So I'm huge on bringing that into it. And then also being a person of color too, I would add that, you know, there's a lot of things that we go through our training, and a lot of stuff is not talked about when it comes to, well, how is this peer that identifies as someone of color, how are they going to be entrenched into a system where this system once, you know, really caused a lot of harm to their family and whatnot. So I think, you know, as we define it more, I think we have a lot of work to do when it comes to how peers are used in different systems across the system of care.
Yeah, I really appreciate both those points about the importance of it being a professional role, and at the same time, the emphasis on mutuality and the emphasis on equity being really, I think, unique to these roles at the same time. And so I think sometimes there's that question then of, well, if this work means that I have to try to look at changing practices and policies to try to incorporate people with lived experience and to try to take those into account and to try to change the way that I do business, and have to think outside of the box of the way that I do these things, why put forth that effort, or why put forth that amount of money and that time and those efforts if it's going to require that much when I have so many things that I may be doing already. And I think what I heard both of you say is that lived experience piece is so critical to the work, and it's a piece that often lacks as a result. That despite all of our good intentions and our educations and our certifications and licensures and policies and regulations and bureaucratic sessions and everything else that happen, that there still is often harm being done because that lived experience lacks. And so peer support, in some sense, by having that lived experience at the table, helps to provide missing information, and that missing information is critical for us to be able to really deliver the best support that we can. And I want to note that that's different than providing the best services we can, because services are a piece of that continuum, but really the best support that we can as a whole. And that may be traditional clinical services, but it may also be resources and connection and belonging and community circles and advocacy groups and mentoring programs and drop-in centers or other things along those lines that are just as supportive and sometimes more organic than what our traditional systems may always necessitate or allow for. And so why use peer support, that I think comes down to that having that lived experience provides service to those who are experiencing those challenges or hardships in their lives. And that without that kind of lived experience at the table, we risk making assumptions that sometimes have dangerous consequences and that aren't always culturally responsive and often disproportionate in their impact, specifically their negative impacts for persons of color. And at the same time, that when you have that lived experience at the table, there's something that happens in the relatability of being able to know I'm not alone in this system. It's okay to feel isolated. It's okay to feel alone. It's okay to feel like nobody gets it and everything is going to hell for a given day. We've been there, and that's okay. And it's okay to be there in that moment, and we're here to support you because we've walked through that kind of fire at the same time. And because we've walked through that fire, then our ability to be able to engage with youth is unique. And that's not to say that often our helping professionals in other roles don't have that same kind of experience. They do. I think a lot of the times I can think of licensed chemical dependency counselors or licensed social workers or counselors or marriage and family therapists, et cetera, who have lived experience as well. But I think peer support then is sort of unique in the way that that works, in that I'm not held to quite the same limitations in the way that I'm able to share my experience. And the way that I share my experience is less concerned about transference in a kind of traditional sense, and more concerned about relatability and understanding the power of connection and the power of belonging, and the way that social capital and recovery capital begin to influence and impact others in what I think is sometimes a more sustainable, but also a longer lasting and more holistic way as well. And so when we have that, we're able to do sort of four main things. And this list, of course, isn't comprehensive, but it includes that inspiring, the assisting, the listening, the empowering, and the advocating as well, and the system change efforts, where it brings those macro and those micro opportunities together, that I'm not just working with an individual, but I'm working towards change within the organization I work with. And I'm working towards change in the community I work with, and I'm working towards change for youth who I may never meet personally, but who my work is still impacting, either because they've received peer support or because they've not been able to receive peer support and the benefits that allows for them. And so I'm wondering, let's start with you, Evelyn, in this case. I wonder if you can tell me some examples of times that you've seen some of these types of activities maybe take place in the interactions that you've had, or what those kind of look like, you know, in sort of a real life experience.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I was thinking as you were speaking about that, and you know, the relatable aspect to this role is really what that is. I really, you know, believe when you define our role and activities of our role as a peer support is really just that human connection. And the first time I actually started in this position was back, 2012. And I remember going into the facility and meeting a young person, and they were in shackles, and, you know, they were mad because they had seen just about every professional in the building, and they're like, oh, great, another professional. So I just sat down with them, and, you know, they were just kind of venting, and I was just sitting there. And the moment that I could show this young person, you know, like, you know, I want you to know, like, yes, I am here as a professional, but I'm a different kind of professional. Like, I'm here to help empower you. Like, I'm here for you as, you know, your support. And I understand, I may not fully understand what you're going through, but I share a similar experience. And I was able to show this young person the scars on my ankles from shackles. And that really opened up a whole new, you know, dynamic of wow. And so I think for me, that moment of like, when you can really just be there and listen. And I just think about all of the young people I worked with, and, you know, some of their responses when I had seen them later on, you know, when they graduated services or whatnot. And it was like, you know, just you showing up to my court hearing, like I didn't have to do anything, right? Just to be there, like, really went a long way for them. So yeah, you know, it's interesting because as you do paperwork, you have to do the paperwork, right, for this job when you're working in an agency. And it's so hard to put that on the documentation of like what you're doing in that moment. So it's like, I'm trying to figure out, like, how do you put that on a piece of paper that we just shared this powerful moment of you get it. And all he had to do was look at me and say, you know, like, okay. And that opened up, right, like trust. And then to be honest, I think, you know, it takes a little further where you do this for one young person, and they also, you know, they tell their other peers like about this cool service called youth, you know, peer support. And so anyway, yeah, just I have many, many different stories, but that one really lives with me as, you know, just being there in that moment to like he felt safe enough and could, then move forward with what he needed in that moment.
Yeah, when I think about, that story that you shared, Evelyn, and just how lived experience really is absorbed in all of the activities that we do as peers, because lived experience doesn't always have to be like sharing your story too, right? I know that there were a lot of youth that I worked with where, especially when I first met them, I might not go in and share my story right away, but I'm always treating them the way that I wish I had been treated when I was a part of systems and services, right? And I think that that's something that also is really missing for a lot of young people, not just because they're involved in systems, but also there's stigma against how young people behave in general, right? So they're not given a lot of decision-making power or opportunities for self-determination in a lot of their treatment planning, or when they're in these like restrictive system settings. And it reminds me of a youth that I worked with where the first time we met, she was in a residential treatment facility, and she very clearly told me, sort of like your youth had explained to you, like, I've met with a lot of professionals and I know that you all are here to help, but like, no, thank you. And so I responded to her. She was new to wraparound, and I said, cool, if this isn't something that you want to do, you don't have to do it. And that blew her mind. And so I offered to her, I was like, do you want to tell your care coordinator? Do you want me to do that? Should we do it together? And that sort of ironically got her on board, because she was like, oh, if you're going to be on my team and working with me and helping me make sure that I sort of have some power in this decision-making process, that JK, I'll do this. And so, yeah, I just think that it's really interesting how the peer support role in terms of sharing our lived experience, I think a lot of the times other professionals or family members or folks who don't really understand the role think it's, us that maybe like comparing war stories with the youth, but it's really us that not only showing them that we've been there, but showing them that we're going to be there for them.
I really appreciate the way you said that, Caitlin. And Evelyn, as I've listened to you speak, one of the things I've been trying to put together is how do you summarize that? And I think the three things that I really heard you say, and I don't think I've ever thought of it this way, could sort of be summarized in sort of three P's that make up peer support. One is that just the power of principle, that as peers, we're people who are committed to certain principles of mutuality and recognizing that individuals have a voice inside of the systems, and cultural responsiveness, and the ability to make decisions on my own. And like you said, Caitlin, the ability to say yes, but also the ability to say no. So the power of principle, the power of presence. Evelyn, is one of the things that I heard you talk about a lot, is that it's not necessarily what we're saying. Sometimes it's just the ability to be there in the midst of what they're going through, and the ability to be able to say, hey, I'm here, and that we're not just there at a given time, but that we're consistent in the way that we show up. And when we show up, yes, as professionals, but we also show up as people who have some of that same shared lived experience. And then really just kind of the power of possibility at the same time. So principle, presence, and possibility of recognizing that where you are today doesn't have to be where you are tomorrow, and that we have the ability to advocate for change on personal levels, and we can do things to direct our lives and to find support and resources, and to advocate against some of the systems, practices, and policies are harmful, and that together we can envision a tomorrow that's different for us individually, but we can also imagine and foresee a possibility of a tomorrow that is different for others and us collectively as well. And so those are just sort of the things that come to mind. But let's move a little bit of this conversation over to implementation. And so recognizing again that implementation is sometimes something that I think a lot of organizations struggle with in terms of if I wanted to hire a peer support specialist. So say I'm listening to this presentation today, And I think, man, wouldn't that be great if that's something that I could have inside of my community? Or wouldn't it be really cool if that was something that we could look into? How do I do that? And so I'm going to start with Caitlin on this one. Caitlin, I know you've done a lot of work around training and implementation science and other things to really look at sort of organization readiness, but also where organizations can really begin some of these conversations and how to do so. And I wonder if you can just touch on some of those kinds of high points of lessons that you've learned, but also things that you've seen organizations may really want to give some extra attention to, or really some maybe extra consideration for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. Well, one thing that I want to touch on is every organization that I encounter now is big on wanting to hire peers, which has not always been the case. Sometimes in the past, folks have really been reluctant to do so for a myriad of reasons. But something that I've seen that I would caution organizations against is just assuming that they're ready to hire and support the peer support role. When we're thinking about assessing for organizational readiness, we don't just mean, oh, do we have the funding and somewhere for peers to sit? We really want to think about what is the culture of our organization? How can we accept peers? How do we address anti-oppression? How do we address stigma? And how do we make sure that we are culturally ready for peers to come into our organization? There are many tools for folks to do this where they can really assess how their organization is culturally responsive, how their organization promotes youth or family voice, how their organization views their clients and the people that they serve. And that's something that I think is really important to do, whether or not you are hiring peers, but especially if you are planning on bringing a youth peer into your organization. It's also really wise to talk to agencies and organizations who have hired peers and where you see peer sustainability. A lot of organizations hire peers, and the peers that maybe will stay for about a year or less and rotate in and out. I highly recommend talking to peer-run organizations as well. There are youth peer-run organizations, there are family peer-run organizations, and I really recommend talking to those organizations about how it is they support their staff and what they're looking for when they hire youth peers. You want to make sure that not only do the peers have a clear definition of their role, but other professionals know what their role is too. Something that I've seen a lot with organizations who are new to hiring youth peers is the peer sort of becomes an assistant class. That is not the role of the peer. And it really creates sort of a unbalanced hierarchy between other professionals in the youth peer role. This is something that we want to avoid because it really puts the onus on the youth peer in those situations to uphold deference to other professionals rather than being able to fully advocate for and support their youth. You want to be able to provide training to other professionals on the role of the youth peer support specialist. And I highly recommend that this training be provided by a current or former youth peer support specialist. We want to be able to see that these our folks in these roles are not just there to, kick it with the young people, but are also professional trainers and can really speak to the experience of what that role is like. I also highly recommend that any organization hiring youth peers seek out coaching and supervision from other youth peers or previous youth peers. Now, this is a lot easier said than done. A lot of organizations just haven't had the developmental capacity where they have youth peer supervisors supervising other peer staff. However, there are opportunities to reach out to other organizations where you might be able to get some supplemental coaching from fellow youth peers in order to really support that role. It's also a really good way for youth peers not to feel so isolated. I remember when I first started as a youth peer, and even though I was working in a youth peer organization, I was in a county where I was the only youth peer. It felt really lonely. So it was really nice to be able, when I had the opportunity, to connect with other youth peers who understood the role, the experience, and we could sort of get some coaching and some training together.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. I really appreciate that. Evelyn, do you mind sharing some of your experience? I know you've done a lot of work on this end as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely echo everything Caitlin said. I started as a youth peer in Washington State, 2012. I became one of the first youth peer supervisors in our state. So a peer to supervise another peer. 2014, I believe, 15. And then I went to the state 2017 and I supported youth peers. And I saw the same thing happening when I was in direct services to the youth peers that I was supporting here in Washington State. Them not being valued just as much as clinicians, the pay and being unequitable, them feeling like there were many clinicians and being told what to do. There's there was confrontation between clinical staff and peers, and I experienced that. And so what I would say, I would hope to move us forward nationally is that peers, I believe wholeheartedly, peers do not belong in behavioral health agencies, that they belong in peer-run organizations. Again, I know that structure is hard for some states, and some states, that's all they do. And I hope that with all of the information we're providing, that unfortunately, when we are embedded in behavioral health systems, we become like the system, and we really need to stay true to our role. And it's hard to stay true to the role when you have a supervisor who is well-meaning, but they went to, they have education in clinical work, and that's not our work. And you often find even them trying to support you in a clinical way. And so there's just all sorts of different things that we don't want to dive into there. However, I would just say that in all of my work, I haven't, we did a pros and cons before I left the state of Washington of what would happen if we did move the peers out of, right? And it's like, well, there's always more pros to it than cons, because again, if you want to stay true to our role and become less system-like, then I totally believe that peers should be embedded with. It's kind of like, I take this from Dan Embry. He called it the mothership of, like they should be with their mothership. Like they should go to, youth peers should be able to go to another youth peer and get that support. The other thing I ran into as a direct service youth peer and supervising youth peers, and then my state level position is like, we talk about them connecting with other youth peers. However, some agencies, whether it's funding or whatever the issue is, may not allow their youth peers to go to a networking, meeting with other youth peers that the state's putting on or another organization. And so I think that, again, we can get away from all of those things. And even situations like this, as we continue to do this work and raise up more leaders, some youth peers don't get paid to do this kind of work, and they should. And that was one of the things that I tried to push before I left the state was, agencies, I know we can't, as state people who have the money or whatnot, can't force, agencies to do something. However, this is having a peer go to a peer networking meeting or whatever is a training that we're actually doing you a favor as an agency, because we're giving them the proper training versus the training that you may think a peer should do, which in then turns, again, way away from our role. So that's what I would add, is just the future of implementation. If we could find a way where we can be embedded with where we need to be embedded would be amazing.
Yeah, I really appreciate the emphasis on that, Evelyn, especially because I think one of the things you pointed out earlier is that often youth don't have experience with a single system. Youth have education experience, they have mental health experience, they have juvenile justice experience, they may have foster care or child welfare experience. And because of that, it's important that there are people who are able to bridge that gap, and they're able to kind of bridge the kind of silos that I think just happen naturally in our systems. And by working for peer-run organizations, there's this real ability to be able to kind of follow youth across those experiences and across those systems in a way that really I think is sometimes more authentic in the way that it works, and it doesn't have the same barriers that occur otherwise. And so in some ways, I think it becomes more responsive because it recognizes that if we're going to try to dismantle the disparities and the disproportionalities and the inequities that exist, we can't use the exact same math and the exact same process that was used that resulted in those outcomes initially. And so we've got to be able to think outside of the box. And I think there's times that's terrifying, right? Like, well, how am I going to work with somebody who isn't even hired by our organization, and what does that look like? But we do it for other roles all the time. I mean, mental health, if I work for a mental health organization, I'm still talking with juvenile probation officers. If I'm working with a school, I'm still occasionally talking with foster care liaisons and ad litems and other people who are still within that system. And so if we can do it there, it may seem like it's really far out of the box, but I think it takes shape in ways that really kind of resemble some of what we're doing while still giving more principle and more kind of recognition of the uniqueness of the role. And so I really appreciate the way that you explained that, Evelyn, and the ability that and the opportunity that I think it offers when we're able to think of those roles as really being unique, but also needing to really have structure to do that. And so, you know, one of the things that I think starts to happen with this is it also then allows for I think some more intentionality in how we recruit and how we conduct interviews and how we do these processes. And I think where we have the opportunity, and both of you I think can probably speak to this a little bit further, but I think where we have opportunity is then for us to really think about what does it look like for peer-run organizations to be able to receive funding. And with youth, I think this is still sometimes a challenge that state agencies and other kind of fiscal sponsors are sometimes maybe a little bit hesitant towards, either because they don't know really what those peer organizations do, or why are they separate, or, you know, what is their role again, or why are they doing that, or do they really have the organization structures in place to provide some level of accountability, and what if things don't work out? And there's a hesitance I think sometimes comes with that, for that. But I'm curious, I know both of you have worked with a pretty wide array of different peer-run organizations, and I'm curious what you would say to some of those supervisors or organization kind of administrators, and maybe even some of those funding sponsors who raise some of those concerns about working with peer-run organizations.
I can start if that's okay. Okay, awesome. So, you know what I was running into at the state level when I was the youth peer there was that they had the concerns, right? A lot of the system people, I was only youth peer on the team, had concerns that, oh, we're gonna, you know, we can't separate, then that will cause a bigger drift, whatnot. And then plus it's a big, long process and all of that. And I think, you know, my response was, you know, I can see how, you know, they think that it's going to be, however, like, I think the part is that they're not understanding what the role is. I mean, again, well-meaning people I've worked with when I was in direct services and at the state, and my supervisors have never been a peer. And so they didn't understand, you know, I would hand them my peer training book, and you can't just read that. I mean, you know, you can read it, but you're like, what does this mean? And so again, I just, you know, my response is, well, we've tried it. And if you look nationally, if you talk to other youth peers, across the nation, you hear the same things over and over. We hear that on, you know, the NTAC Center that David and I are a part of, is, you know, the equitable, like, peers are on wraparound teams across, you know, the nation. And here in Washington, we have a program called WISE, Wraparound Intensive Services, but peers are not paid the same as clinicians, but peers are really used and utilized more than clinicians, because especially for transition age youth. But again, we're not paid equitable. And I really, you know, one of the things that I believe a peer run org can do is pay them equitably, because they understand it. They understand that, yes, you may not have a degree, but that's not why, you know, we don't have to have that as a requirement. And that was one of the things I even ran into as a direct service youth peer. When I was promoted, I was making less money than the clinicians at the agency. And I was a supervisor, and I was told time and time again, if you want more money, go back to school, which is, a huge slap in the face to us youth peers, because again, that's not what, and so then, I just think strongly that the clinical world doesn't really have a strong sense of what we do and why it's important and why we are just as equitable as a clinician. As somebody that's, providing that service, we're also providing a therapeutic service as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Evelyn. And I love that you come at it from the perspective of having worked with the state, because I come at it from the perspective of helping to run a youth organization, where I wish we had a peer liaison at the state, because it probably would have made everybody's life a lot easier. Because there was that constant sort of having to re-explain what the service is and the re-explaining of the role, right? And one thing I will say about working with a peer-run organization is, while we might not have been paid equitably with clinicians or other professionals that we were partnering with, there were certainly more opportunities for advancement within our organization, or supportive opportunities for us to think about other career paths that we might want to go down, right? There was also that community of peers that you definitely had, which was really helpful, especially when you're coming across these bigger systemic issues that feel a little bit unsolvable. So I think that for implementation, it's really important, and for sustainability, to think about, just to highlight what you were saying, how are we going to make pay and opportunities equitable? And how are we going to make sure that the peers feel appreciated and like their role is valued?
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think one of the things I appreciate about what both of you have said is that that value for equity really doesn't only focus on equity for the youth and who we're serving, and the trauma-informed approach or understanding also doesn't just apply to the youth. It really changes, and it kind of transforms, I think, the way that we work with our own organizations, and what it means to be a team, and what it means to be an organization, and the way that we do work otherwise. And so if we say equity is a part of what we do, then yes, it changes the way that we provide services or that we provide support. But it then also, I think, has to change the way that we think about youth voice within the role of the organization. It changes the way that we have to take consideration of employees' experiences and the support that they receive into consideration in the work that we do. If we're thinking about trauma-informed systems, it doesn't only mean that we're taking into account the trauma that the youth and families who we serve have experienced, but it also means then that we're taking into account that often the systems that we are working with have their own kinds of trauma that they've experienced as well. And so, I think as peers, part of the value of the work that we bring and the viewpoint and the perspective that we bring then is that it really allows for us to understand and approach those systems from a trauma-informed perspective, in the same way that we use those same values to approach individuals. That we don't just see them as failing systems, but we also see them as systems that have high amounts of turnover, have seen large amounts of change, have not always been supported in the way that they needed to, and continue to see a large need for additional support and change in the same way that many of our youth and families experience the same challenges. And so I think with that, there becomes a real opportunity for us to think holistically, I guess, in the way that we're doing it. And that's what I love about peer support, is it's not just sort of a one-on-one interaction, but again, is this kind of holistic approach and this holistic understanding that allows for us to address not only problems as they may appear, so we're not just talking about behavior, but we're talking about society, and we're talking about culture, and we're talking about social determinants of health, and how all those kinds of things really begin to play into larger pictures. And in doing so, I think the opportunity that's provided really begins to sort of expand itself as well. And so we've talked a lot already, I think, about some of these challenges and barriers that sometimes exist of caseloads and tokenism and the importance of supervision and the importance of peer-run organizations. Let's just go a little bit into, with the rest of the time that we have, let's just move a little bit into some discussion on expansion. So where's youth peer support headed? We've already, I think, begun to touch on some pieces of this today with thinking about peer-run organizations, thinking about peers not being contained to single agencies or systems. We've talked a little bit about the importance of equitable salaries and things along those lines as well. Tell me a little bit more. Caitlin, when you think about where you see peer support heading and some of the opportunities that are available, what are some of the things that maybe come to your mind for where you see this maybe going in the future?
Well, I know that we are starting to see more evaluation being done on the role of peer support and how that positively affects youth progression and youth mental health. So I do see, and I have seen in my work with various organizations, more and more organizations prioritizing working with youth peers and youth peer support. In addition to that, I think that there are a lot more states that with various funding, such as state block grants, the Healthy Transitions grants that we've seen come every 5 years, things of that nature, really focus on implementing youth peer support and supporting youth peer organizations, particularly through low barrier means. So things like drop-in centers, community-based peer support, things for young people who might not reach the level of distress where they're accessing clinical services, but are still in need of support and can go and get that within the community without cost and no need for the billing of insurance, right? I think that that's something that has frequently been a barrier is limited Medicaid funding for peer support, and the fact that peer support is a lot more than just meeting one-on-one with youth, which is the only thing that you can bill for within Medicaid. Peer support is a lot of travel time. Peer support is a lot of casework. Peer support is a lot of preparation for meetings. Peer support is a lot of sort of being that liaison with other professionals. It's not just, maybe the couple of hours a week that you're meeting with one young person. I also think that we are seeing a lot more in terms of specialized peer support, right? So rather than having a peer support specialist be considered sort of a one-size-fits-all or be able to speak on behalf of all youth, we're seeing a lot more systems wanting specific experience within peer support, which I think is super, super important, because not every single experience is going to be the same. And that means that we're not always going to have that shared understanding, right? So I think that we're seeing peer support being much more widely accepted, which I love. We're actually seeing evaluations that are being done on peer support, not just about how they positively impact youth, but what are just some of the trends that we're seeing in peer support right now. And David, I know that you worked on a study related to that, if you want to talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. But then again, just finding peer support that is more culturally specific for young people and more specific to their experiences within different systems, which I think is really important. And Evelyn, I know that you've done a ton of that work, so I'd love to hear more about that too.
Yeah, no, that's great. I would agree that we're seeing more and more individuals wanting a specialized peer. For me, growing up, I was not hospitalized. I was incarcerated. Although I needed behavioral health treatment, I landed in the JJ system. And so, I was asked to, do peer bridger work, which was going to the hospitals, which I could do, but I would try to explain to my, leadership in the agency, I can't fully relate where this other person could. And they just thought, no, you're good. You've been through something. And I'm like, so just more and more specialized areas, I think. And also just, the workforce for, BIPOC, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Washington state is not really diverse, as most people think, but majority of our people of color are incarcerated, which is true for across the nation. And, when I first became a peer, I'm a person of color, but I'm also passing and I also have certain privileges. And so I saw, the room was, there's not a lot of people of color. And so I think as we, continue our efforts like with Youth Move National and NTAC and all these different projects, and even here as people are hearing this, just being mindful, we have to understand. When I was working with young people, I really worked with a lot of Black and brown young men because they were incarcerated. That's who made up the majority of the population. And as a peer, I couldn't relate wholeheartedly. And so what I would always do is I would always have, a mentor in the community or somebody that looked like them to be able to really help them. I think it's one thing when me as a female saying to a young man or that's Black or brown, like, yes, mental health services worked for me. Yeah, you're a woman. Like, there's so much stigma on mental health in men in general, and then take men of color. And so, it was really frustrating, I think, that agencies didn't understand that. Like, you can't just throw somebody in something and expect them to support. Like, you really have to be intentional. And so I would hope that as we're expanding that we're more intentional about who we're hiring, and with that, not tokenizing and not, hiring that one person of color to work with all your clients of color, but to really be intentional about who we're serving, I think is a huge thing, especially in the state of Washington, for sure.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. And I agree with both of you on those points. I think one of the challenges is, again, even in the peer world, I think often when we think of lived experience, what we still find predominantly is a very white peer workforce. And with that, I think some of those values that we want to promote and some of those things that we want to be able to see take place within peer support are often limited by some of those barriers that currently exist. It's challenging, for instance, when we find that often our funding sponsors are only willing to give to specific types of entities, that unless you're a federally qualified health center or you're a local mental health authority or you have maybe you're a university or a specific hospital, often those grassroots movements, those urban leagues, those small other kinds of nonprofit organizations and grassroots efforts often are sort of overlooked, even though they're often more ingrained in a part of the culture and part of the community that are working with those populations that could most benefit from the supports. And so while those funding streams are available, I think one, we advocate for them to be. In the meantime, I think we have to be real intentional in the way that we think about subcontracting. And that when we think about sort of a continuum of care, we have to think about Black-run nonprofits, and we have to think about grassroots leadership efforts, and we have to think about advocacy organizations and civil rights groups. And we have to try to think about what it looks like to try to ensure that funding is given there in a way that's less restricted and saying this is what it needs to look like from a white perspective. But to be able to say, look, there's things that we don't know, and there's things that you know from the 50 years of work that you've done in this community that we're not going to know in 2 months of putting together a needs assessment and coming in as outsiders. And instead, I think when we can do that, I think it opens up the opportunity for us to really begin to see peer support take place in some really unique ways that maybe we aren't seeing as commonly available, at least at the moment. I think we start to see more alternative peer groups start to develop. I think we start to see have more natural places that are safer for youth to be able to go to, and that they are maybe more frequently found and feel safer being able to talk to. I think we find that the role of natural support systems, such as neighbors and coaches and other people in the community that may sometimes be over-policed inside of communities and seen as problem makers, are instead really seen as community assets. Where we can promote health educators and we can promote health coordinators and health navigators as potential roles for youth peer support specialists to be able to play, but that we really begin to embrace an understanding of social determinants of health and understanding of peer support that, again, isn't just a formal service, but that is really involved as community resources and community aids, that the role, as I think both of you have mentioned, the role of peer support is not to try to embed peer support inside of specific organizations. When that happens, it's great, but it's best and most effective, I think, when those roles are really able to be involved and be an active presence inside of the community in a way that often has been limited by those funding sources. And we see that in other places. We've seen that in the Primadoras, for example, down in the Valley here in Texas, where those roles have been able to kind of help connect individuals to health services, and they've been able to provide health literacy, and they've been able to really be community resources and sources of expertise for making referrals, but also being able to provide culturally responsive services and supports in ways that our traditional systems have lacked. And so having those Pomodoros then really begins to make a difference in the way that that works. And then I think that evaluation piece really becomes critical as well, where evaluation isn't just a nice thing to do, but that we really begin to break out of the mold and what we think outcomes really are, that we're really looking at outcomes for youth peers. We're looking at outcomes for people in the workforce. We're looking at outcomes for systems, and we're looking for outcomes that aren't just clinical measures, but that we're thinking about employment, and we're thinking about housing, and we're thinking about the ability to access nutritious food, and we're addressing things like food deserts, and we're thinking about discrimination and microaggressions and how those are experienced within communities. And when we can begin to understand, again, those social determinant of health factors, I think we can really begin to understand that how we measure peer support is going to tell us the effectiveness of it. And if we're not looking for the right measures, and we're not looking for the right kinds of outcomes, and we're asking the wrong questions, logic says you ask the wrong questions, you get the wrong answers. So I think how we begin to think evaluation begins to play a really critical role, and again, really points to the need for peers to really be driving evaluation as much as they're driving the rest of the decision-making process as well. I realize we're really close on time. As we start to close, obviously we've seen a lot of changes and new opportunities at the same time as a result of COVID, other events that have happened across our country in the last year in particular that have continued to raise awareness about racial injustice, racial inequities, and other types of disparities that continue to exist across our country. And I'm curious, when you think about what maybe the last year has taught us collectively, what are some of the top kind of lessons learned that you would take from COVID and those other things I've just referenced that maybe inform what you think peer support could look like going forward?
Well, I think that COVID has really reinforced the idea that youth like to use technology to communicate. Something that I did when I was a youth peer support specialist, which was very taboo at the time, is I had set up separate social media accounts that were related to work only to communicate with a lot of my youth. And frequently, that was how most crisis intervention happened. Youth were much more comfortable doing things like using text message, Messenger, Snapchat, things like that, in order to talk about any kind of suicidal ideation that they might be experiencing, any sort of, obsessive thoughts or things of that nature. Young people do not like to pick up the phone. I don't like to pick up the phone. If you leave me a voicemail, you know when I'm getting that? When my voicemail box is full. So I think that COVID has just really reinforced that young people like to use technology in order to communicate. A lot of the times it's sort of a barrier breaker for them, even though maybe for professionals it feels like we really want that one-on-one human connection. And not that that's not still important, but I do think that having peer support in virtual and online settings is going to be pretty phenomenal for the field.
Yes, for sure. I would echo that as well. I think one of the things, lesson learned, and I'm not at the state anymore. However, when everything was transpiring with COVID and all the racial injustice, which we know has been happening in our country for 400 plus years, the thing when I was supporting the peers here in Washington was, when everything started transpiring and people had the opportunity to actually see what was happening in our country, the youth peers that identified as peers of color felt like they were not getting the support they needed in their workplaces. And so one of the things that I wanted to do, for the peers themselves was not do a traditional leadership training for peers. No, like we need to talk about racial injustice and how they are feeling in their agencies. I mean, talk about somebody not feeling safe in their own workplace, right? And that's like, it was huge. And so I think lessons learned is really like, yes, we all, leadership is huge for peers. And I speak about leadership and peer support all the time. However, it's not enough. And we need more trainings about, courageous conversations is one I think about, just all these different things, the equity affinity groups we're doing with NTAC. I mean, we really need that safe space to be able to process what is happening that's on TV. Our young people who are in services also experience the same thing. And so then you have someone who's in a paid position that's going through something very similar. It really just, again, helps the idea of removing peers from traditional behavioral health services. And I think another thing is lesson learned. We need peer support everywhere. We just don't need it in a, young people can only access it if they're going to go see a clinician. I think that they should be able to access it regardless if they're in therapy or not, that it is its own, therapeutic service that more than half the time empowers them more than, sitting and talking about whatever it is in their therapy session. So I would say those are our lessons learned from the last year.
Thank you to both of you for those thoughts. Completely agree with you on both of those fronts. And, I think one of the things that sticks out to me, I saw an article a while back that looked at the number of youth who have participated in some sort of advocacy or activism effort over the last year. And what we've seen is that number has risen substantially. And I think what it tells us is, one of the things that stuck out from the article was that really youth have been involved in more advocacy and activism efforts in the last year than they've been at any other time in recent data collection. And what I think it tells us is that if we're not addressing racial equity and we're not having those conversations, and we just kind of cross those conversations of current events that are happening out from our conversations as peers, we're not addressing really where I think a lot of our youth are coming from. And so we do need those safe spaces. We need them as peers. We need them for each other. We need them also, I think our youth need them as well. And the more we can find ways to build that community support, whether it's in virtual settings, whether it's in Discord channels, whether it's in some of those other channels that are sometimes more private, but also more secure for us to be able to have those conversations. I think the more we're able to build those spaces, the more it allows for us to be able to have those conversations in some really productive ways. And so I recognize we're right at time. Evelyn, Caitlin, I just want to thank you for your expertise in these conversations. I realize these are topics that each of you have worked on for long periods of time, and that we could probably talk about for days if given the opportunity. And so thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. For those who are able to see the PowerPoint, I know our email addresses are on here. Evelyn can be reached at eclark@changematrix.org. Caitlin can be reached at Baird, BAIRD5 @pdx.edu. And I can be reached at David, DAVID.McClung, MCCLUNG @austin.utexas.edu. And again, those are available in the PowerPoint, which may be easier to access in this case. But thank you so much for joining us in these conversations. I know each of us would love to be able to hear from you, learn more about what your communities are doing, and be able to continue some of these conversations. And so we look forward to having those conversations in the near future. And thank you again for your time today.